Welcome back to Eyes on Israel. I know that we have to deal with the Iranian threat. Obviously, Iran is marching towards a nuclear weapon, and Israel has always known that it would have to eventually deal with this threat. And you might think that, hey, no time like the time, there's no time like the present. They just launched 300 projectiles at us. We might as well go after Iran. But as you were saying, Elliot, you have to have a plan, and this might not be the best time. Could you elaborate on that?
First of all, retaliation is part of a deterrence kind of a strategy. And first of all, let's be clear, retaliation is what happens when deterrence fails. If deterrence works, you don't have to retaliate. On the night of the attack, Israeli deterrence failed totally. In other words, zero deterrence. The Iranians fired their 300 missiles of various types. Hezbollah fired 100 rockets into the Golan simultaneously. The Iranians took a potential Israeli response into account and then simply ignored it and fired anyway. So deterrence value at that point for Israel is zero. That's number one. We've moved now qualitatively into the stage of actual warfare between Israel and Iran, past, again, what I call the shadow proxy stage. Now we're in open warfare. Retaliation is an inappropriate response or an inappropriate strategy for warfare. You know, when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, America didn't say, well, they sank 4 battleships and destroyed 200 planes. We're going to sink 6 battleships and destroy 250 planes. We're at war. War means a whole different thing. It means taking a global perspective. As a matter of fact, Japan got America into the war, but the American strategy was Europe first. Why? Because you have to think globally. Same thing here. Israel's fighting Hamas. It's fighting Hezbollah. It's fighting the Houthis. It's fighting the militias in Iraq and Syria. And, of course, Iran behind that, coordinating it. But it has to deal with all of those simultaneously. That's on one side. On the other side, you've got a coalition that's now been cobbled together, which is a great thing for Israel. And you have to pay a price for a coalition. Once again, as the Americans and Brits learned in their coalition with the Russians in World War II. You don't necessarily have to love everybody in it, but you've got to deal with it if you want to hold it together.
Hold on, let's just clarify for our audience what you mean by a coalition here. Are you referring to the Saudis and the Jordanians who helped Israel with their defenses, or are you referring to something broader than that?
And the Americans and the Brits and the French. In other words, anybody who's standing now nominally with Israel as part of a coalition that didn't really exist 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago. And it's fragile, as coalitions tend to be. If Israel's considerations have to be all of those simultaneously. Now, there was word this morning that America has tacitly agreed on an Israeli operation in Rafiah in return for not a massive response against Iran. In my opinion, fair trade, good trade for Israel. We're talking now not about feel good. We're talking about how do you use your assets, your capital, and I'm talking about political capital, in the best way possible. Getting rid of Hamas is the number one immediate priority. Deal with that, see what's going to happen, further on down the road. One final point apropos retaliation and why it's a problematic strategy under the best of circumstances, and that is that it gives the initiative to the other side. In other words, retaliation is always something that you do after somebody else does something to you. They're calling the shots, they're setting the timing, they're setting the scale, and you're simply responding to them. In my opinion, it's a bad strategy overall, but in this particular case, it's totally inappropriate.
When we keep in mind the fact that Hamas is a proxy of Iran, it's funded by Iran. The Houthis are essentially an extension of Iran. They're a closer proxy, and Hezbollah, as you always point out, is actually, we shouldn't call Hezbollah a proxy of Iran. Correct. Hezbollah is a branch of Iran. It's actually it's just like a chapter of Iran. They are Iran. So if we're already fighting Iran on multiple fronts, we're fighting them in Gaza, we're fighting them on the northern border when we fight Hezbollah. So it's not like, Iran needs to get their comeuppance for firing a lot of missiles at us last week. we're already fighting with them, and which fronts we choose to fight on has to do with our strategic goals,
Exactly.
not giving them a slap because they did this. But I have a question here that underlies this whole thing. You've been watching Iran more closely than most people. You're really and you're still getting, our audience is still getting to know you. I've known you for many years. You are one of the leading Iran watchers in the country. You've written on this. You've lectured on this extensively. As someone who's been watching Iran for so long, what do you think they were trying to accomplish? Again, going back to what I said when I teed you up in the previous segment, this was not a symbolic volley of attacks. It wasn't like what they did in the wake of the Soleimani killing, where they launched a few things at some empty buildings at an American base, not really intending to do any harm. As I mentioned, the story that Donald Trump told Maria Bartiromo. This was more than a symbolic attack, which means that Iran... What do you think, again, as a professional Iran watcher, what do you think Iran was trying to accomplish?
I think it was trying to accomplish two things, one domestic and one strategic, and the two are interrelated. The domestic one is, as I mentioned earlier, once they got on that treadmill after those first few days of the Biden, please don't hit us, and parenthetically, although they didn't say it explicitly, you can hit Israel. The Iranian leadership ramped up its rhetoric, and no country, no leadership wants to look weak. A dictatorship cannot look weak to its own population. So once it put itself in the position of we're going to show the Israelis, teach them a lesson, it couldn't back down. And by the way, in the 2 weeks prior, there were two separate internal Iranian attacks by ethnic groups against the Islamic Revolutionary Guards. Casualties were inflicted. In other words, there was a weakening there that the leadership needed to deal with. So that's on the domestic side. On the strategic side, I believe that the primary target of their strike was actually the airbase that was hit by two of the missiles, although there was no serious damage, at Nevatim, which is where the F-35 squadron is based. That's not a military secret. Everybody knows it. They wanted to take out that base, do as much damage as they could, maybe take out some planes in the process, which is why they sent extremely heavy missiles in that direction. They also were aiming at some targets in the north. There might have been a sort of sideshow toward Dimona, just on the Hail Mary sense of let's see if we can hit it, and possibly targets in the center of the country. Once again, since everything was taken out, it's kind of hard to tell what they were really aiming at, but perhaps Ben Gurion Airport. But to be able to get up in the morning and say, we eliminated an airbase, and possibly also Hatzerim airbase outside of Beersheba. We eliminated an airbase or two. We destroyed X number of planes. We took out an intelligence base in the north, et cetera, et cetera. We really inflicted heavy damage to Israel in response for its aggression, quote unquote, Iranian leadership. So it was a serious strategic attack. It wasn't simply symbolic. It wasn't the kind of attack that was launched against the American bases after Soleimani, where they said, okay, we hit the Americans, thank you very much, let's all go home and leave it alone. Had that attack succeeded, Israel would have been forced to launch a massive response against Iran. It wouldn't have been a response anymore. It would have been, now we're at war, we have to go after them.
The Iranians know that Israel is a nuclear power.
Correct.
Israel has, we never admit it publicly, Israel has nuclear weapons. So that means that the Iranians were willing to go down that road.
That's right.
At this
time.
time.
I say deterrence failed. And I also believe that that's one of the reasons, certainly not the only reason, but one of the reasons for the American, British, and French coalition stepping in to try to prevent it. Because whenever they talk about we don't want to see escalation between Israel and Iran, in the back of their minds is always, if something goes wrong, Israel's fallback is nuclear.
Was Iran humiliated by the failure of this attack? And if so, what does this mean going forward? Meaning Israel will likely make a decision to either do nothing or to do something that just shows their strategic dominance. Meaning, I've heard rumors that Israel might just strike a specific target to send a message to the Iranians that they can strike wherever they want, or they might choose to do nothing for the reasons that you laid out. How do you see the Iranians proceeding going forward, where right now they kind of have their tail between their legs, and the rest of the Middle East is looking at them saying, "Oh, that didn't really work, did it?"
Right. So first of all, the Iranians are lying through their teeth to their own population. They're showing pictures of a forest fire and saying that it's Tel Aviv in flames. They're showing photos of a riot in South America and saying that it's the Israelis fleeing for their lives, and all sorts of nonsense like that. They have to. They have no choice. As I said earlier, a regime like that cannot get up and say, "Oops, we failed miserably. We're really impotent." That's the end of a dictatorship. Absolute end.
Right.
Once again, whether Israel acts or doesn't act, in my opinion, it should not be an in response. In other words, the Iranians know that we can hit whatever we want in Iran. We've already flown F-35s over Tehran, and we've told them about it afterwards. So the planes can get in, they can come out. What I believe is that we will continue doing what we've been doing, which is hitting Hezbollah and unfortunately getting hit back in the back. Or they've been doing the hitting, we've been responding. Interdicting Iranian moves in Syria as best we can, including strikes of the type that started this round against the generals in Damascus. But we've been hitting Iranian targets in Syria now for, 7-8 years at least. And I believe that's going to continue. That has nothing to do with the tit for tat. And this comes back to my point. This is the strategic thinking that's involved in winning a war. And we haven't gone, to full scale yet, because once again, you can't fight them all at once. One of the things that you talked about earlier, I'll finish with this, is not just Israel's strategic objectives, it's also its military limitations. In other words, Israel doesn't have the power to take on everybody all at once. We've got to slice it and dice it and prioritize.
All right, Major Elliot Chodov, thank you once again for joining Eyes on Israel. We will certainly have you back many, many times. We'll be right back with more Eyes on Israel in just a few moments.